Thank you very much. Margaret Mary didn't quite tell the whole story, so I'll tell a little more of the story. I'm very happy and grateful to be here with you today for a number of reasons, and I'll share those with you. I'm also going to share a little bit more about myself, talk a little bit about FAN, but then also talk about what is action. I know one of the sisters earlier had asked the question, have we moved to action? And an important question is, before we move to action, what is action? And let's try to define action, and then we can start talking about how we move to action. So I'm going to share that with you, but I'm really grateful to be here with the Allegany sisters for a couple of reasons. First of all, if it wasn't for the Allegany sisters, FAN would not be around today. Margaret Mary was one of the founders. She serves as our president, at least for a couple more months, of our board of directors, and she really was the inspiration behind creating FAN. With some of the OFMs and a couple of the other Franciscan communities. Margaret McGee sits on our board, and when I first came to Washington, she was one of the first persons I met, and we met, we talked, and we realized that my father and her parents came from the same small town in County Cavan, Ireland, in Baileyborough. So we figured out we have to be related because everybody in that town is related to each other. So, and I often tell people I'm not a Franciscan, I'm not a professed Franciscan, and before I came to FAN, I didn't really have a lot of contact with the Franciscans, although I have an uncle who was a Franciscan priest in Belfast, but he died at a very young age, and so I never actually got to meet him. And so when they were interviewing me for the job, they asked what my connection to the Franciscans was. And I said, well, in the town I grew up in, there was a Franciscan high school. I didn't attend it, but some of my friends did. And so I guess that was enough of a connection to get me into the Franciscan family. I am part of the Franciscan family and Franciscan hearted. I don't know if some of you have ever had a chance to meet Amanda, who's now the person for Franciscans International in New York. And when I say the person, she is the person for Franciscans International in New York. And she and I have talked about we're going to create a fourth order of Franciscans. We're going to create the Franciscan-hearted Franciscans. I often get asked, and let me say, this is a wonderful time to be connected to the Franciscan family. If you've been listening to our new Holy Father, Pope Francis, just his wonderful statements, and I don't know if you heard this morning, he announced he appointed a cabinet or a council, and I think it's 8 or 9 cardinals, I'm not sure. And the one he appointed from the United States was Cardinal Sean O'Malley. And his first appointment at Curio was a Franciscan. So I tell all my Jesuit friends, if they're nice to us, we'll teach them the secret handshake. By the way, I do get asked periodically, how do the Franciscans feel about a Jesuit getting elected Pope and taking the name of St. Francis? And I tell them, all of us, when we were younger, through our youthful exuberance, have made errors. And we're just so grateful that as the Holy Father got older, he's seen the error of his ways, and he got wiser, and he's now seen the light. And so we're grateful about that. One of my good friends that I've worked with in Washington is a Jesuit priest, and he sent me an email, and he said he's really glad, and he hopes that Pope Francis, has the humility of the Franciscans and the organizational skills of the Jesuits. I sent him back one saying, let's pray that he doesn't have the humility of the Jesuits and the organizational skills of the Franciscans. So I'm also grateful, not only because of what the Allegany Franciscans have given to help FAN grow and become the organization it is, but I'm grateful to each of you for what you've done. I often share with people, last year I was at the Franciscan Federation gathering, and many of you have been there in the past. It was about 530 Franciscan sisters and about 20 guys, and so it was good. I shared 2 things. One was, I thought it was somewhat ironic. There were about 530 Franciscan sisters, which is about how many members of Congress we have. So what we should have done was taken all of the sisters that were at that gathering, move them to Washington, let them run the country for a year, and take all of the members of Congress and let them go off and do what you all do for a year, and then see what would have happened. But I also, as I looked around that room, and again, over 500 Franciscan sisters, and I calculated, I don't want to give ages away or anything, but I calculated that in that room there was about 20,000 years of service to the poor, of feeding the hungry, of healing the sick. Think about that for a second. You all have contributed over 20,000 years of living God's life each and every day. And so I'm very grateful to all of you for that and for the example you've given me and my generation of going forward. I share this with Margaret Mary all the time. I feel obligated whenever I speak to a group of sisters to apologize, because when I was growing up, I was taught by Sisters of Mercy and also Sisters of St. Joseph, and if any of you were teachers, you would not have wanted me in your classroom. So I apologize for what I did to those poor sisters back then. I apologize to each of you. My background, my parents are immigrants. They came over in 1950. They came from Ireland, as I mentioned. My mother was from Belfast, my father from County Cavan. And they were very poor Irish Catholics. They had little money. When they came over to America, my mother tells the story of getting off the boat. She had one baby in her arms, another on the way, and not 2 nickels to rub together. So I grew up in a very poor Catholic neighborhood. And a couple things about it. I mentioned the Sisters of Mercy, and they really are wonderful women. I was one of those children that was in trouble a lot for various reasons. I was also a very smart child, but I was in trouble. I have a tendency, I'm a bit fidgety. If you think I'm fidgety now, you should have seen me when I was 8, 9, and 10 years old. But when I was growing up, and I think I was probably 8 years old, we didn't have much money, and so I had a pair of gloves. And a pair of gloves where my mother had kind of gotten old gloves, put tape around the fingers to hold them together, put some tape on the palm to hold them together, and I was embarrassed by these gloves. I didn't want to wear the gloves. And so, when we went outside for recess, you had to go put your gloves on and go out, and I got made fun of by a lot of the other kids because my gloves were all ripped and torn and shredded. So I discovered that, and if you're teachers, I was a teacher in my earlier days, and I did the same thing. If a child doesn't do their work, what do? You tell them they can't go off for recess. They have to stay in and do their work. So I figured out that if I didn't do my work, I wouldn't have to go off for recess. I wouldn't get picked on in recess. So I stopped doing my work, and then the sister would come over to me and, ask me what was going on, and I'd say, oh, I just didn't get it done, and then she'd make me stay in. Well, this happened a few times. And the good sister, Sister Catherine, she could have called my parents up. She could have said, your son's a problem. There's issues here. We need to talk about this. She didn't. She observed me a couple of times, and then she figured out what was really going on. And I came into school one day, and in my desk was a brand new pair of gloves. And I said to Sister Catherine, Sister, somebody must have left these gloves in my desk. And she said, I'm pretty sure an angel left them for you. And so I actually had a chance to bump into Sister Catherine years later, and I thanked her because she was the angel that left those gloves for me. She could have just taken a whole different tack, reported me to the principal, got my parents in, talked about why I was misbehaving, but she realized there was a problem, and it had more to do with not doing my work than being embarrassed about this. So I'm forever grateful for that. I've had a blessed life from God, and part of it was because of the example and the kind of sometimes gentle, sometimes not so gentle push I got from folks like that. As I mentioned, I grew up in a very poor neighborhood. My mother had a 6th grade education. She left school. She was the oldest of 8 in Belfast, so she had to leave school in 6th grade to take care of her 7 younger siblings. My father grew up on a farm in Ireland and couldn't really read or write, and so when they came to America, they settled in a poor Irish Catholic neighborhood, and one day a black family moved into the neighborhood, and I know many of you are Irish, so you understand the Irish are not the most open people, or they weren't at that time. They were somewhat racist, and so the neighbors were all talking about how terrible this was. And my mother went down, knocked on the family's door, introduced herself, and invited the mother of the family to come down and sit on our front porch and have tea with her. So she did, and that was it. It ended all of the discussions in the neighborhood. That family, a year later, converted to Catholicism. They were a Baptist family, and they converted, not because of anything my mother said, just because of that one simple act that she did. I asked her years later why she did that, and she said, you just have to remember that this is not our land, this is not our country, this is not our earth, this is God's earth. And if we don't welcome God's children into our homes, how can we expect God to welcome us into his home when it's time? And so I learned about social justice from my mother from that perspective. I also learned about caring for all of creation from my mother. One day I was walking down the street and I was drinking a can of soda and I threw it on the ground. And my mother made me pick up not only that can, but every other can around. And I asked her why, and she said, same thing, this is God's earth. This is God's land. We should respect and honor it and not destroy it. And this is going back in the early 60s, so it was before that was popular. So that's how, where my background came from. As I said, my mother didn't have a lot of education, a lot of learning. She read books constantly, but she had a Franciscan heart. She often told me that, she was the one who raised it was her youngest brother, and she was the oldest, and her youngest brother became a priest, and she raised him to be a Franciscan priest. When I was younger, she tried to push me into the priesthood, actually sent me to a seminary for 2 years. I didn't make it very far, but I think that's where I did get my Franciscan spirit from, was from my mother. My father, on the other hand, was not a very nice person, and like a lot of Irish men, he was an alcoholic and very abusive, and so I suffered the other side of that. And I remember one day I was at church, and Monsignor came over, and my father was also very active in the church. He was one of these men that was an usher and one of the leaders of the men's group and all of this stuff. And the Monsignor came over and said how lucky I was to have such a good example of a Catholic father, and that I should really follow in his footsteps. And then that afternoon we went home, and my father didn't like the way the food was cooked, and he threw the plate of food across the table at my mother because he didn't like the plate of food. And one of my brothers got up to say something. He smacked my brother. And I thought to myself, this is an example of a Catholic father. This is what we're supposed to be following. So I kind of got both sides of the coin there. I grew up, I worked in a factory for several years to save money to go to college. When I went to college, I became a union organizer and got involved in organizing for labor movements. I got arrested for the first time while I was in college, picketing in front of Yale University when they were going through one of their strikes. After college, I spent a year hitchhiking around the country. I was a bit of a hippie, and so I just kind of bummed around and stuff. And then when I came back, I went to graduate school and went to work for the Connecticut Health Department as a statistician. And when I was working there, I organized the state employees into a labor union. And I later became president of that labor union. And then a few years later, I got burnt out from that, and I left and became a corporate executive. So my friends all told me I sold out to the dark side. I'd also left the church by that point in time completely, but I met my wife, Stella, and she brought me back to the church. And she encouraged me, and she said she didn't want to be married to a guy where the wife takes the kids to church on Sunday and the husband stays home or plays golf. So if we were going to enter into a serious relationship, I had to make a commitment to her to find a community. And she was she was part of a Catholic church, and she said to me, we can leave the Catholic church and find another faith community, but we have to have a faith community. And I said no, because I like the rituals of the Catholic church. So I found a really good parish, which I'm still a member of in Connecticut, and I became very active in that parish. I started doing social justice work with the parish. Our pastor's a great pastor. I think the reason I actually did get the job was Margaret Mary had called him for a reference, and they talked about 8 hours. So, if you know Margaret Mary, my pastor talks even longer than that, on and on and on and on. And, both of them have a hard time getting to the point sometimes, and so it was good. So he's a good pastor, and that really kind of brought me to where I am today as the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. And people do ask me, how did I end up here, not here, but in Washington as the executive director? And I tell them, about 2.5 years ago, I was in my office at my parish, and a good friend of mine that I work closely with, who was a Sister of Mercy, came into my office, put a piece of paper on my desk and said, this is a perfect job for you. And I looked at it, and it was the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. And I said, well, Julie, 2 things. It's in Washington, and I have no connection to the Franciscans. And she said, I know that, but I prayed on it, and God told me this is the perfect job for you, so you need to apply for it. And I did. So when people ask me how I got here, I tell them this is where God wanted me to be, and I just said yes to God. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm here today. FAN, as an organization, for those of you who don't know, was created 5 years ago. There was a meeting in Baltimore. Margaret Mary was at it. Some of you may have been at it, where the Franciscan leaders, the provincial leaders, the congregational ministers, the justice and peace leaders all gathered. I think there was about 180 people at it for a weekend to talk about how the Franciscan family could work together on social justice issues. You all know this. I don't have to tell you. You know this better than me. one of the charisms of the Franciscans is working on social justice issues. And so the thought was, how can we all come together, work together, and as one Franciscan family? And out of that meeting, FAN was created. And so we are an organization that is supported by the sisters, by the friars, by the secular Franciscans, and by a lot of Franciscan-hearted people. And so we came together. We've had a few stops and starts. As Margaret Mary mentioned, I came on board and didn't really have any money to pay me. I'd actually talked to my wife about it, and I said, well, they offered me this great job, but they have no money to pay me. And she said, God bless her, she said, you know, I had a niece living in Washington at the time. She said, go down, stay with Abby for a couple of months, see what happens, and then if it doesn't work, you can come back. Your job will still be at the parish. They'll still hire you back there, and so see what happens. And I did. And 2.5 years later, I am getting paid. I want to reassure you all that I didn't work 2.5 years without getting paid. But although, Margaret Mary kept telling me, don't worry, you're going to get your reward in heaven. And so that kind of is how I got to where I am and how FAN got to be where it is. We are an organization, a coalition of all of the different communities, including, by the way, some of you may not realize this, Franciscanism is an ecumenical organization. There's a whole order of Anglican Franciscans, an order of Lutheran Franciscans. There's a whole order of ecumenical Franciscans. Their leader is a Methodist minister, and they're all part of FAN too. So when we talk about FAN as a part of the Franciscan family, we mean the entire family, not just the Catholics, although Catholics are the predominant group within it. But we do welcome all of the different parts of the family in. I was in Philadelphia, and I'm sure, Margaret Mary, the only reason my picture was in the Ashton was because I was with Sister Marie Lucy. And so that was, Marie Lucy, who some of you may know, is from the Ashton Franciscans, and she's our director of advocacy. Everywhere I travel, people say to me, oh, you work with Marie Lucy. Isn't she wonderful? I say, yeah, have you ever worked with her? Have you, So, but I was in Philadelphia at Newman University a couple weeks ago, and one of the sisters came up to me and said, in Philadelphia, they're doing, I guess it's their 350th or 400th anniversary. And so they're having next summer this whole family celebration, because Philadelphia is the city of family. And so they're bringing families together and having a whole huge celebration centered around families. And this Sister Betty, came to me and said, could you organize the Franciscans, because you're the one group that can bring the Franciscan family together, and maybe we can do something in Philadelphia to really highlight the work of the Franciscans, the whole family. And I took that really as a real strong compliment that FAN is an organization that connects the Franciscan family. People often say to me, you must have a large staff because of all of the stuff that you do, and I don't. I have Sister Marie Lucy, who I mentioned is our director of advocacy. Lonnie Ellis is our organizer and development person. I had Christine Elliott, but she left and entered the novitiate. I told her it was okay, it was a Franciscan order, so she could do that. She started last week her novitiate, but before that she was working with us. So I just hired a young man, Rhett, who's from Milwaukee and is a secular Franciscan who's coming on board. I have Rhonda, who's a half-time administrative assistant. And that's our staff. And Janine Walls, who works out of Connecticut and does communications. That's our staff. And so I don't have this huge staff. I don't have 30, 40 people running around. What I have is the entire Franciscan family that I can call on. So and just to give you an example, we were doing stuff on the death penalty, and Kathy wrote a blog for our website for us that we got up on our website. So I can call people up and say, we're focusing on this issue, and find experts. We use people like Keith Warner and Sister Ely and folks like that will write blogs for us, do workshops for us as we're going forward, and it's awesome. So it seems like I have a large staff, and I do, but I just don't pay any of them. They're all volunteers from within your various communities. And I'm very grateful for that as well. We couldn't do the stuff we do if it wasn't for all of the people within the Franciscan family. And again, it is such a wonderful time to be a Franciscan. Thursday night, sometimes I lose track of what days it is. Thursday night I gave a talk in Rhode Island, and it was on creation, care for creation, and climate change. And so there was a rabbi, it sounds like a joke, but it's not. There was a rabbi, an imam, an Episcopalian woman priest, and a Baptist minister, and myself. We were the 5 people giving talks. And every one of them got up and spoke about how hopeful they were because of our new Holy Father and taking the name of St. Francis. Every one of them told a little story of their connection to St. Francis or the Franciscans. So we were hearing it from, the Jewish perspective, from a rabbi, from an imam, from the Muslim perspective, from the Baptist, every single panelist. And I was the last panelist. I got up and I said, well, I don't really have to say anything. They all told our story already, so we don't have to say it. But that's just the way, people are feeling about St. Francis and St. Clare. At the end of my talk, I really encouraged the people in the audience to get to know St. Francis and St. Clare. It said, if you don't know St. Francis and St. Clare, please take the time to get to know them, because there's a lot more about Francis than the bird bath. And as I often say, I have a friend who's a Franciscan priest who told me his mission in life is to go around to all the statues of Francis and knock the birds off. Because, not that it's a wrong image, it's not that it's a bad image, but it's not the complete image of who St. Francis is. And we should have more statues of St. Clare out there as well, to have that image as well. So we work on issues like immigration reform, human trafficking, climate change. Most recently, we've gotten very heavily involved in the issue of gun safety. We work by doing advocacy work on Capitol Hill. We work by going out to the regions. We ask you all to call your legislators, meet with legislators. It has a lot more of an impact if your congressperson hears from you in your district than if they hear from me in Washington. And what has a real strong impact is if you get 100 calls, and I equate one sister to about 50 people. So if you got 10 sisters to go and meet with a congressperson that are from his district or her district and talk to them, that would have a huge impact on what they do and how they think. And then when I go to Washington and I go and meet with their staff or with the congressperson, first thing they say to me is, oh, I met with a group of Franciscan sisters recently. And so they will sit up and take notice. So as we talk a little later about action, that's, simple steps like that are things that can happen. So we do those kinds of things. We work mostly with interfaith groups. We're part of a number of coalitions, the Interfaith Coalition on Immigration Reform. We're part of an Interfaith Moral Action on Climate Change. There's an organization, a group that started up called the National Partnership for Climate Solutions. And we've been asked with the evangelicals, we're part of that, and we've taken a lead among the faith communities of trying to raise awareness of the connection between our environment and our faith. For us, and we say this all the time, climate change is not an economic issue, it's not an ecological issue, it's a moral issue. And I use that for almost everything. When I talk about immigration reform, I tell people this is not an issue of the moral issue. We talk about the federal budget. I tell people the federal budget is not a document, an economic document. It's a moral document about where our priorities are as a nation and as a people. So we're really trying to instill that value that these are all moral issues. I often share a story and this is last year, just about this time last year, I had this particularly interesting week. It was Earth Day. So Monday, I gave a talk in Washington on climate change, on a Catholic perspective on climate change. Tuesday, there was a hearing at the Supreme Court on immigration reform. So I was over in front of the Supreme Court, and I was asked to speak on the Franciscan perspective on immigration reform. Thursday, there was a meeting on human trafficking. So I was at a meeting on human trafficking in Washington and talking about human trafficking. I came up Saturday and gave a talk in New York on climate change. And then I was taking the bus back to Washington on Sunday, and I started thinking, what's the connection? Where is all this connected? Where's that thread that connects all of this? And really it came to me, and it's no great revelation to any of you, but it's how we're connected to each other. That thread is, all these issues are the same issue. Are we in right relationship with each other? Are we in right relationship with God? If we were in right relationship with God and each other, then there wouldn't be any of these issues. So now we're trying to really move that forward and ask people, are you in right relationship with each other and God? If you were in right relationship with each other, we wouldn't be talking about passing immigration reform. We'd be talking about how can we welcome folks into this country? How can we take care of them? We wouldn't be talking about adaptability with climate change, we would be talking about how we're better caring for God's beautiful creation. So we need to kind of get to that point. So let me talk a little bit now about what I came to talk about instead of all this other stuff, about effective action for justice in the spirit of St. Francis and Clare. And by the way, did you guys get a chance to meet my daughter, Jenna? You know, years ago, Jenna always tells me I embarrass her, so I'm going to embarrass her one more time. And so I often would say to her, when you become a parent, they give you this manual on how to be a parent. And the first thing in it, it says, your most important duty as a parent is to embarrass your child as often as you can. And Jenna mentions to me that I succeeded in that. I may have failed in the rest of parenting, but that part I absolutely succeeded in. So we look at our Franciscan values. I mean, everything we do, we should start with our Franciscan values. And first and foremost is joy. Whatever we do, we have to do with joy. Years ago, I was involved in social justice, and I'd go to gatherings of people that were on this issue or that issue, and they were some of the most miserable people in the world. I mean, they really were. You've probably experienced this. I often say that progressives are just miserable people. They don't really understand joy sometimes. And I remember going to this one, and I was walking around to all the different exhibits and all the different booths that were there, and it was Save the Whales and Save this and Save that and whatever it was. I mean, I was depressed at the end of the day walking around. And I was with this woman, and I said to her, where's the joy? How come there's no joy here? Everybody seems so down and depressed and angry. They're very angry. And she said, well, we can't have joy until we solve all these problems. And I said to her, remember what Gandhi said, to be the change that you want to see. So if you want to bring joy, then you have to be joy. And so whatever we do, whatever our work is, we have to do it with joy. If we're not doing it with joy, then it's just not worth doing. Peace is our second value. And again, we have to have peace with what we're doing and peace with how we're doing it. So whenever we're meeting with people, and with peace comes civility. We have to talk respect. We're going to talk respect a little later, but we have to respect other people's views as we're talking to them, and we have to do it in a peaceful way. Next we have is respect. And that's so important. In Washington, D.C., there's just no respect at all for people's views, for people's positions. People shout at each other. They shout above each other. Nobody listens. We should have a value in here of listening, but that should be part of all of them. Nobody listens. We have to respect another person's views. We have to honor their views, and then they'll respect us. We also have to respect where people come from. I shared a story about my father. Years later, I forgave my father for what he did to me. I did that because I came to realize that he was acting out of his own hurt and pain. And so, and I asked his forgiveness for the way I treated him, because he was acting out of his hurt and pain, and I wasn't respecting him and honoring him enough to understand that. Not that it made it right what he did to me, but at least once I realized that, I could forgive. So we really do have to have that respect. Service. And I feel silly standing in front of a group of women and talking about service because of all of the service that you have given. And so you could tell me about service, but again, that's part of our values, is service, and particularly service to the marginalized, to the poor, to the needy. Diversity. So we have to be diverse in what we do. We can't just say we're going to do one little thing. We have to be diverse and focus on a number of issues, and we have to be diverse with the people we work with as well. We cannot, say we're only going to work with the saved. We have to welcome everyone. I often tell a story about my pastor. I was with him one day in our church walking around, and this woman came in. And so he went over to her, as he always would if he saw somebody he didn't know, introduced himself, and she said she's brand new. She and her husband just moved to the town, and they're looking for a good Catholic church to go to. And so he proceeded to tell her a little bit about our church, what we do, and then he looked at her and he said, I hope you're a sinner. And she looked at him, her jaw dropped, and she said, what? And he said, well, St. Mark's is up the street, and all the really holy Catholics go there. All the sinners come here to St. James. So if you're a sinner, come to St. James. If you're one of the holy Catholics, go to St. Mark's. So, we have to welcome those. Jesus welcomed the sinners. Reverence. And that's so critical. What we do, we have to do with reverence and with God. Otherwise, we're doing it for ourselves. Years ago, I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in the labor movement. I was very active in social justice. At that point in time when I was doing that kind of work, I didn't have a strong faith commitment. I got burnt out from doing it because I was doing more for myself. It felt good to do it. I felt like I was saving the world for me. It wasn't until I found my way back into my faith and back to God that I went back and started doing social justice work, and it had a whole different meaning for me because no longer was I doing it for me, I was doing it for God. And I was able to surrender to God to do that. So that's so important. When I first came down to Washington, D.C., one of the things that amazed me, as mentioned, we worked in interfaith groups, and one of the things that really amazed me and how you'd go to a meeting and they wouldn't start off with prayer. Now I want to say Margaret Mary's organization, Bread for the World, always started off with prayer, and thanked her for that. But I would go to meetings at the Catholic Conference of Bishops, and we'd sit down, have our coffee, and then they'd start talking about the agenda. And I'd say, excuse me, aren't we going to pray first? I mean, we're at a Catholic organization. Shouldn't we be praying first? And then they'd say, oh, well, of course, yes, let's pray first. Now they all start off with prayer. No matter what group we meet with, they start off with prayer. They got tired of me coming to the meetings and saying, aren't we going to pray first? So we have to have that reverence. And finally, our value is of compassion. You have to do it with compassion, and that goes up with joy too. It's the first and last is joy and compassion. You got to do it with joy, and you got to do it with compassion. The only way you can be in compassion is to be in relationship with people. And I'll tell another little story. I love telling stories, and so my daughter Jen is so good she can actually repeat most of my stories. Now sometimes I'll start to tell a story when we're at home or somewhere, and she'll just start chiming in and telling them stuff. So in my parish in Connecticut, we used to have this program that we would collect stuff for the homeless. And then we would, we wouldn't even bring it over to a homeless shelter. The homeless shelter would come over and pick it up. So we'd have a coat drive. And, Catholics are very generous. We got lots of coats. And then the homeless shelter would come over and pick up the coats, and then they'd bring them. Or we collected toiletries or whatever. And one day a small group of us got together and we said, we're missing something. This isn't really what we're supposed to be doing. We found out in Bridgeport, Connecticut, there's a place underneath a bridge where all the homeless congregate. So we started a program called The Bridge. So now we collect stuff and then we bring it to the bridge. And then we spend Sundays with the homeless people. It started out with 6 of us, spending Sundays there, praying with them, talking to them, hearing their stories. Now we have about 70 people from my parish. We have families, mother and father and their kids, that go over and spend a couple of hours with the homeless. And you can imagine what impact that's having on those children who are going over and spending a few hours with homeless people and getting to hear their stories and know their stories. So you can't have the compassion if you're not in relationship, if you don't know a person's name. You can't have compassion for them otherwise. So that's so critical to it. So we want to talk a little bit about values for Franciscan engagement. And again, a lot of these you may have seen before. One of the things about Franciscans is we just borrow from everybody else. And so I borrowed a lot of these from Father Tom Nairn, who's at the Catholic Health Association. But our first one is care for creation. That's so important to everything we do in our engagement. We have to acknowledge that all creation emanates from the goodness of God and exists as footprint of God, and are dedicated to the care of creation, seeing all creatures as brothers and sisters. And again, when I did my talk Thursday night, and I've been doing this more and more, sometimes when we say care for creation, people think about going out and gardening or going out and doing different things. When Francis talked about care for creation, he had a whole different perspective on it, because Francis viewed creation as his brother and sister. And so for him, it was about being in relationship. We talked about compassion, but it's about being in relationship with all of creation. The stories of Francis, and you all know the stories of him preaching to the birds and to the wolves and to all of creation. And it's a whole lot different than saying I'm going to care for creation because God told me to. It's almost paternalistic. I'm going to care for something, as opposed to being in relationship. So when we talk about our first value, it's about being in relationship with all of creation, and then out of that relationship comes care. Our next one is the dignity of human person. And again, we have to emphasize the dignity of all human people, all human persons. All human persons are created in God's image. and who achieves fulfillment in relation to God and into their communities. And so if we don't respect that dignity of the human person, then we're not in relationship with them or with God. Our next one is the consistent ethics of life. We're actually talking to some folks in Washington, D.C. about doing a whole workshop, a conference in the fall on consistent ethics of life. This seems to have gotten lost a little bit within the Catholic family as part of the Right to Life movement. They don't focus on consistent ethics of life. They focus on one issue, yet our consistent ethics of life talks about all issues. I'm so grateful that our new Pope has talked about caring for creation as a right to life issue. And Benedict did as well, and so did John Paul II. They talked about it. In fact, Benedict said, care for creation is one of the most important right to life issues, as important as any other right to life issue. That doesn't follow through sometimes, so it's incumbent upon us to make sure that that follows through, that whatever we do it with a consistent ethics of life. Next, we have respect for the poor and the vulnerable. And that's so obvious that we need to do that. And respect means more. We're going to talk in a little bit about charity and justice. Sometimes we think respect is good if we just give people money, like I talked about my parish, just collecting stuff and having them come and pick it up. But that's not being respect of the poor. That's just trying to be, again, paternalistic over the poor. Our next one, heralds of peace and reconciliation. You've all heard the story of Francis and the Sultan. We need to be peacekeepers, and we need to do that all the time. I'm becoming more and more conscious of the language that I use. And just to give you an example, we're working with a group of people on climate change, and we're trying to focus on 16 Catholic Republican Congress people who we think we may be able to get them to change their mind a little bit, get them to come out and talk about climate change. And so when we initially started this, as a small group of us, we started talking about targeting these Congress people. And then, I thought about it, and I said, and we actually were drafting some documents, and we called them, our targets. And I said, no, let's change the language. Let's focus on these folks. Let's not target them. So, when we talk about peace and reconciliation, it has to be in our everyday language as well. Next one is our right relationship with justice. Of justice. And again, we talked about that a little earlier in creation. We have to be in right relationship with everyone, with all of us, and with God. My pastor will often say, if you want to know what a person's relationship to God is, look at the relationships to their neighbors, and then you'll see how their relationship to God is. Right relationship of justice is different than doing charity. And it's important to do acts of charity, but that's not being in right relationship of justice. The next one is demanding change and conversion. It's not enough for us to, do this stuff. We have to actually demand that we change. I often tell people, I'm really tired of sitting around holding hands and singing Kumbaya. I love the song Kumbaya, but all of us sitting around holding hands singing Kumbaya isn't going to affect change at all. We need to take action to affect change. And we need to demand action. We need to demand action of our leaders, whether they be our congressional leaders, whether they be our bishops, whatever or our organization, we need to demand action from them to change. And the other part of it, remember, is no one ever changes in their comfort zone. So we need to, in order to change, we need to get people out of their comfort zone. That's why the Pope washing the feet of those two women was such a powerful message, because it got all those other cardinals out of their comfort zone. All of a sudden things are different, and they're now worried. And finally, for our values for engagement are being agents of change. And again, it's not enough to just know the message. We have to be at the forefront. Particularly as Franciscans and part of the Franciscan family, we have to be the ones out there being agents of change. And let me say, before I move on to the next section, you all have done that already. I've started off by telling my story up here, and I shared this when I was up at the your mother house. You all have wonderful stories to tell. You all have lived the life that Jesus told us we should be living. So to be part of being an agent of change is to share your story with everyone else. And it's not being egotistical, it's not being arrogant, It's just telling your story in such a way that it's going to inspire other people. So I would encourage each of you. I told Margaret Mary, up at the Mother House, you have all those young women and men that are students at St. Bonaventure's. Invite them over for dinner some nights. Bring them over. I mean, students are always looking for free food. And so if you really want to get them, get a keg of beer, but you probably shouldn't do that. But invite them over for dinner and have some of the sisters tell their story, because your stories need to be heard. Your stories are the stories of what it means to live the life of Jesus. It's not going to do anyone any good to have your story die with you. So please, I beg you, don't be afraid to tell your story and share your stories with everyone. And I don't know if there's any colleges around here that you can connect with, or parishes that you can connect with the young people where you can go and share your stories, invite them to come to wherever you're living to share a meal and share your stories with them. Your stories need to be heard. So, next slide. We have 3 ways of Franciscan social engagement, 3 examples. Our first example is Berard and his companions and their engagement for the salvation of souls. Our second one is the example of Francis and Sultan in engagement as a dialogue. And then our third one was the early rule, which is engagement as transformation. Next slide. And so each story does tell a story of conversion. In Berard's story, conversion is submission to an order that is beyond human making, but accessible to people through God's gracious revelation. And again, be open to God's revelation. I often tell people, I'm one of those folks, I'm very skeptical at times. So if I was walking down the street and I saw the burning bush, I would run and get a bucket of water and throw it on it to try to, if you're not open, and part of that is if you're not have a contemplative mind, you're not prayerful, you won't be open to God's revelation. So we have to do the action, but we also have to do the prayer part of it. They're not separate from each other. The second part of it is Francis and the Sultan, and you all know that story. It's a call to people to fulfill their deepest potential as human beings by allowing Christ to become the answer to their deepest human desires. That's what that story tells us. I'll tell you another story about Francis and the Sultan, but take it. We all know the story of Francis and the Sultan from the Franciscan perspective, or from the Catholic perspective. I recently had an opportunity to meet with an imam who shared the story from the Muslim perspective. And it was a fascinating discussion because a lot of Muslims know that story also. And he shared with me a story he had heard. And again, there's a lot of mythology around the stories, around all of the stories, but this is good. So I hope it's true. I don't know if it is or not, but I hope it is. But he shared about, Francis met with the Sultan. And the Sultan that he met with was the nephew of the Saladin, who was the leader of the Muslim armies that recaptured Jerusalem. When the Christians first captured Jerusalem from the Muslims, they massacred everybody. They massacred all the Muslims. They massacred any Jewish people that were living there. So it was expected when the Saladin recaptured, that they would do the same thing, that they would go in and massacre everyone. But he didn't. He allowed the Christians to leave if they wanted, and if they wanted to stay, they could stay and practice their religion. And the same thing with Jewish people, that they could stay and practice their religion. And this imam told me the reason he did that was his nephew, who had met with Francis a couple years earlier, was with him. And his nephew was so inspired by Francis that he told the Sultan, this is not the way to go. Now again, I don't know how much truth there is. I heard it from the Muslim side, but it's a great story. And so let's hope it's true. And even if it's not, it's still a great story. And then from the early rule, we remember God has created all in God's own image, but with a task of growing into God's full likeness. Conversion becomes a response to seeing the gospel lived in the lives of committed followers of Christ. And so it's not enough to be baptized. It's not enough to, be created in God's image. We have to grow into God's likeness, and we have to be transformed. And that's what you all have done. And I thank you for that. And again, you need to set the example of other people to do that. Okay. Next we have, what is justice? We talked about social justice. We talk about we have to do justice. Again, just like with action, we have to talk about what it is. The demands of justice must first of all be satisfied That which is already due in justice is not to be offered as a gift of charity. This is from the Second Vatican Council. And then from Cornel West, this is one of my favorite quotes. Justice is what love looks like in public. So it's not just about doing charity. There's a story, I don't know if I have a slide on it, but I'll share it, about two men were fishing at a riverbank one day. And they heard somebody floating down the river drowning and screaming. So the two men dropped their poles, they swam out, they got the guy, they pulled him back onto shore, they made sure he was safe, they made sure he was dry, and then they went back to their fishing. A little while later, somebody else was floating down the river drowning. Same thing, they jumped into the water, they swam out, they got him back, they made sure everything was fine with him. A little while later, a third person is floating down the river. So the first man jumps in the water, and he starts to swim out. And then he stops and looks back at his friend, and he says, aren't you going to come and help save this man? And his friend says, no, I'm going to go upstream and find out why everybody's falling into the river. So justice is finding out why people are falling into the river and doing something about it. Charity is pulling people out of the river. Charity will never be true charity unless it takes justice into account. Let no one attempt with small gifts of charity to exempt themselves from the great duties imposed by justice. This is from Pope Pius XI. And again, this is not an either or. We need charity because there are people who are poor, there are people who have needs, but charity without justice is just that. It's just charity, and it's not really living the Gospels if all we're doing is charity. I often ask the question, how many people would donate money if it wasn't a tax deduction? And I don't want to raise that issue because we get lots of donations from people and their tax deduction because we're a nonprofit, but think about how many people really would be. And are they really donating any money, or are they just shifting who they give their money to? And so is it really charity that they're doing? They're not really giving out of their own, so they are sacrificing, they're giving out of their excess a little bit, not from what they need. Next one. So charity and justice, let's talk a little bit about that. Charity supplies Christmas hampers, emergency food shelters, and handouts. Justice looks at the wages and welfare on which people are supposed to live and asks the question, why are people hungry? Why is unemployment so high? Charity gives money to calls for overseas reliefs. Justice looks at multinational companies and asks, why are people poor? Why do the really rich pay no taxes? How can we redistribute the world's resources? I often ask people a question. If you believe that God created this earth, this beautiful, wondrous earth, regardless of how God created it, regardless of whether it took 7 days or 7 million years or 7 billion years, if you believe that God created this earth, do you think God created an earth where there's not enough resources to feed every man, woman, and child on the earth? And the answer would have to be no if you believed in a God of love. God of love would never create an earth that there wasn't enough resources. The problem is we've decided how to allocate those resources. So we've made the decision to have some people have lots of resources and most of the people have very few. I'll show a slide later that talks about 2 billion children are living in extreme poverty in this world. Every day, 16,000 children die of hunger. Every single day of the week, 16,000 children die of hunger. And so, you have to think about that and ask yourself that question. Why would God create an earth where 16,000 children are dying of hunger? God didn't create that earth. God created an earth with more than enough resources, but we've chosen to let some people have more of them. Charity is tax deductible. Justice is not recognized on any government form. So, you can check off your tax deduction on your taxes for a charitable contribution. I do it. You can't check off justice anywhere. You can't give money to justice. Charity is socially acceptable. It's laudatory, especially for politicians and celebrities. Charity can buy you votes. Political campaigns, political candidates all talk about how much money they gave to charity. Mitt Romney and Barack Obama last time were, talking about how much they gave to charity. And when we give awards out, we're building a hospital, when we name a wing of the hospital, who do we name the wing after? Somebody that donated a lot of money to the hospital, right? That person may have made that money off the backs of the workers. He may have made that money through slave trade in Africa. It doesn't matter. He donated this money to a hospital or to a school or something like that. And so we honor them for that. Justice is socially, politically, and economically the biggest risk you will ever take. Social justice can get you shot. Charity is more popular an activity than social justice is. Is it any surprise? I mean, doing social justice can get you shot, can get you arrested. I've been arrested several times for doing justice. Others have been arrested. It can get you crucified. We saw Jesus was crucified. So charity, on the other hand, will get you nice awards and plaques on walls and things like that. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a understanding of charity and social justice. And again, this is not to say that one is more important than the other. You need both. You need to have charity, but you also need to have social justice, because if all we're doing is charity, we're really doing nothing. And we're just keeping the problem going and going and going. So that brings the next question. Why action? So less than 1% of what the world spends every year on weapons, think about that, 1%, less than 1%, was needed to put every child into school by the year 2000. So if we had just every nation cut their defense budget less than 1%, every child by the year 2000 could have been enrolled in a school. Right now there are 2.2 billion children living in poverty. I'm sorry, there are 2.2 billion children, 1 billion living in poverty. 50% of children live in poverty, live in extreme poverty. I mentioned earlier, every day almost 16,000 children die of hunger-related causes. So why do we do action? If we took 10%, just 10% of what the world spends each year on weapons, we could feed all of the world hungry. Every man, woman, and child could be fed if we just took 10% of what, I'm not saying cut out all of our defense spending, I'm not saying cut 50% of defense, just 10%. And if each nation did that, we could feed every single man, woman, and child. We wouldn't have any children going hungry. Think about that for a second. 10%. Imagine what we could do if we cut 25%. What is action? Action is working with others to promote justice, peace, and care for creation. We don't do action alone. We do it with others in coalition. We do it with groups of people. But it's to create that justice and peace and the integrity of creation. Dom Hedler wrote, "When I give bread to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why people are poor, they call me a communist." Oh, wait a minute. Wrong way. Okay. Next slide. St. Francis' love of Jesus inspired him to public preaching and to take on the concerns of others. He reached out to the leper, the poor, and the marginalized, recognizing Christ's presence in them. So why do we do action? We do action because we're Franciscans, and this is the Franciscan way. I've been gathering with a group of the Franciscan intellectual tradition to talk about, we have all these books that are written on care for creation, the Franciscan intellectual tradition on care for creation, on beauty. We don't have any books written on why we do action from a Franciscan perspective. So a number of the Franciscan theologians and intellectual tradition folks like Keith Warner and Ely and folks like that are going to try to put together a book on what in the Franciscan teachings drive us to do action. Why do we do action? Not how to do action, but why as Franciscans. Again, one of the things to keep in mind though, and we're going to talk about what is action too. Action can be almost a lot of different things. For me, action is protesting a lot, getting arrested, raising issues. That's not for everyone though. There's a good sister, Bernadine Franciscan sister, Sandra Lyons. She's on our Action Commission. I just couldn't for the life of me imagine Sandra ever getting arrested. Yet Sandra, as a midwife, delivered 500 children. Now that's action. She did that with love and care, and that's doing action. Doing action can be working in your community. Doing action can be raising awareness with people. Or doing action could be like myself and others do in chaining yourself to a White House fence and getting arrested for doing that. They're all part of action. There's no one right or wrong. Sometimes when we talk about action, people get scared because they think, oh, you're going to try to get me down to Washington to get arrested. I've been trying to get my daughter to do that for a while and I haven't succeeded. So, but that's not necessarily, Kathy does a lot of action on the death penalty. And a lot of it is writing blogs, educating people, and how we do that. We talked earlier about the values. If we're doing that with those Franciscan values, then we're doing action. Next slide. We should not prescribe what others should do, but to understand and strengthen in every human life prayer, lifestyle, service, preaching, and advocacy, which for some are the concrete expressions of the love of God. So again, if we're doing action, doing it in a way that we're expressing God's love, then it's action, and it's action for God, and it's transformational. If we're doing it for our own personal gain, then it's not transformational. Next one. Francis recognized God's work in creation and loved it. He celebrated the beauty of God in creation and loved God all the more for this gift. We have to be in right relationship with everyone to do action. We have to be in right relationship with all of God's creation. Francis saw God in everything. If we see God in everything, then whatever God calls us to do, we will do with joy, and that will be our action. There are different kinds of actions. This is the St. Francis Pledge. You're probably familiar with that. I'm not going to read it all to you, but getting your community to take the St. Francis Pledge, which I think the Allegany sisters have all taken, but getting it, within your families. Action could be making sure the lights are shut off, so we're saving electricity. Simple things like that. But doing the St. Francis Pledge is an example of action. So I'm going to finish up with a couple of slides. One is, and I use this slide with a lot of people. I feel really silly saying this slide to y'all because you do this all the time. But let us dare to live the gospel. The core of Franciscanism is the living out of the gospel of Jesus within the church, according to the rule of life proposed and observed by St. Francis and St. Clare, to preach this message to every creature. You're doing this, so you have to inspire others to do this in whatever they do, whether they're lay people, whatever type of work they do. We're doing a whole program on Franciscan colleges now of integrating Franciscan spirituality into everyday life on the Franciscan college. Brother Keith Warner is doing it for us. We've gone to 2 schools where we've done it at and had folks from 10 different Franciscan colleges. So, it's about English professors living the gospel by how they teach English. People who, pick up the garbage, living the gospel by how they do the work that they do and how they do it with joy. So the next one, let us dare to live the gospel. From James chapter 2. What good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, "Go, I wish you well and keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself is not accompanied by action, is dead. So that's a great passage from Scripture. A lot of people try to edit that out of the Gospels, edit that out of the letters. They don't really like to talk about that part of it, but real important. Faith by itself is not really going to, do anything. I often get into discussions with my evangelical friends who will say, you just have to profess faith in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and you'll be saved. And I say to them, and how do you profess that faith in Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Is it words or is it through your actions? So, let us be a presence that disturbs. Again, I talked about singing Kumbaya. My pastor up in Connecticut, I talk about him a lot. He often will say after his homily, or at the end of Mass, if you're not feeling uncomfortable, I haven't done my job as a pastor. And if you're not feeling uncomfortable, then I would urge you to go find another faith community where you do feel uncomfortable, because you're never going to transform in your comfort zone. And so you're not here to come to Mass on Sundays so you can feel good. You're here so you can transform, and the only way to transform is to be uncomfortable. Get out of your comfort zone, and then be that presence that disturbs, because you're helping other people transform if you're the presence that disturbs. It's not within the Franciscan spirit to disturb for the sake of disturbing, and then to leave others to pick up the pieces. We're called to replace what is lost with something different. And just remember, Jesus was a disturbing presence in society. Jesus didn't walk around and hold hands with people and sing Kumbaya. There's nowhere in the Gospels where it said he did that. Jesus, if you might recall, turned the tables over in the temples. If you went through and look at all of the times he called Peter, all the names he called Peter, and all the different names he called some of his other disciples and apostles, he was a disturbing presence. And he should be a disturbing presence today in a society that some say are worthy of God's love and others are not. So, we use Jesus now to be exclusive. We use Jesus to say who's in and who's out. And Jesus should be a disturbing presence to disturb those people who think, some people can be in and some can be out. And again, you all know that. You've lived through it the last few years with the investigation of LCWR. Hopefully, with the new Pope and everything, and our new cardinals up there, it'll change. But the reason that investigation was happening was because you all were the disturbing presence to those cardinals. And they didn't like that. They didn't like to feel uncomfortable. And you were challenging them. That's what we have to do. And finally, let's step into the future. There's always that temptation to avoid the future and continue to relive the past. Encounter is crucial, not to love people generally, but actually. Francis encountered real people. We know their names. Can this be said of us? We are not called to be disinterested charity, but real encounter with real people that we can know. And so, again, your stories are wonderful stories to share. Share them with people. Don't live in the past, though. By sharing your stories, you're going to be encountering real people and inspiring real people. And so I'll end it there. And again, I thank you for all of the work that you've done. I thank you for the inspiration that you've been for me going forward. And I look forward to working with all of you in the future and seeing you all. Kathy moved out of Washington, so I won't see her as much, but So I'm trying to make her feel guilty so she'll come back, But thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick.